I'm here with Jason Taylor, who's Managing Director for Sustainability Advisory and Finance at the National Bank of Canada, and Elizabeth Wallace, Senior Manager for Funding and Foreign Exchange in the Capital Markets Division at the Ontario Financing Authority. Delighted to have you both here. This is a fantastic subject. We're seeing huge growth in ESG throughout markets, but particularly in fixed income, which is what I'm focused on. So I just wanted to start, Jason, with a broad question. How big is this market? How fast is it growing? And why is it so important now for Canadian fixed income investors and issuers?
Yeah, great question. And it's something I think a lot of dealers and syndicates grapple with trying to put on forecasts because it always exceeds. Last year, there was somewhere around 800 billion globally across all labels, and forecasts started to come out that we would potentially see the first $1 trillion year of issuance. And lo and behold, it came in, I believe, the third quarter. So a quarter to go, it's outpacing most of the bank's expectations. So the question is, how far can it really go? And what's exciting is to say that sustainable finance is being democratized and made more accessible to more industries. Not everybody is on a linear pathway. A lot of them are constrained by technology. So that's very encouraging. Locally here, the market is growing very healthy in a healthy way. Last time we're buzzing around 20 billion here in Canada, and with a variety of labels starting to develop. City of Toronto having done a second social bond recently, and Elizabeth will be able to speak about the growth in her program. But and you can see that there's also two and potentially three very important frameworks that are being worked on in the background now that will also add another catalytic effect. So, and we saw this SLB market gain traction here in Canada. So all in all, growing very, very well in a healthy way, I would say.
Is it across sectors? I mean, Canada's a natural resource country traditionally, but are you seeing it through the banks, through every kind of issuer?
Yeah, I mean, traditionally it's followed the geographic industry splits that you would see in other parts of the world. So power and utilities, financials, and certainly the real estate sector here. But more recently, we saw something emerge from the oil and gas sector, from Enbridge and from TELUS. So you're starting to see more industries. But I would say beyond that as well, the other ones who traditionally may not have been considered to be the high emitting industries are asking a lot of questions, and I think, which is great. It's encouraging for investors because when they tried to build thematic bond portfolios, they want to be able to not compromise diversification characteristics. So they're now getting a wider diversification across term, across sector, across labels. So you can see that I really use the term democratization. It's becoming very accessible now.
And obviously we'll get to ask this to Elizabeth, but in your view, what are the benefits to an issuer? Are they saving money doing this format? Is it a way to get better funding costs for a borrower?
Yeah, there's definitely tangible benefits. The greeniums, it's something that people enjoy to follow. It's always nice to be able to put a financial value on the effort that goes behind working on all these frameworks. Elizabeth will be able to, I'm sure, give us better insight on that. But I think more importantly, there's some very sort of qualitative benefits as well. Green issuance can be very beneficial for accessing green pools of capital, to adding resilience to the funding base, but it's also very effective in some cases mitigating potentially a brown discount that may loom around certain types of profiles. And I think it's enabled to buy some time and create a dialogue with shareholders that that most people recognize that takes time to transition organizations. So it's bringing in a lot of cross collaboration and learning between not only investors but issuers, and in some cases even NGOs. So I think for me, definitely the greenium is always very interesting to follow and point to, but I think there's some qualitative benefits as well that are equally just as material in this process.
Do you want to speak to that a bit, Elizabeth? I mean, what's your perception? Do you save money doing it this way? Is it a diversification of the investor base? Are there other benefits that we haven't looked at or discussed?
Drawing on Ontario's experience as an issuer of green bonds, those are two of the major benefits: the expansion of the investor base and the ability to raise funds in a cost-effective manner. There's also some maybe less thought about benefits that do come to mind. Certainly greater issuer investor engagement comes through this kind of market. There's just a lot more ongoing dialogue when you're issuing a green bond because of the amount of pre-work you do and also follow-up you do in the way of impact reporting and other things. There's also a higher profile associated with this type of issuance, so you do get maybe more of a spotlight than you would with your regular issuances. So these are some other benefits that might come into play. And really you are provided in some ways with a highly leveraged communication tool by accessing this market. You have a lot of outreach that comes your way because people want to know more about what it is you're doing, how you're doing it, what they can learn from your particular experience. So some sort of more ancillary benefits, but equally important to the cost savings and the broadening of the investor base for sure.
And unlike a lot of ESG issuers, you're quite experienced. You've been quite a trailblazer in this market, and obviously others could learn a lot from your experiences. I mean, what would you say to other types of borrowers that that they should really pay attention to when they're issuing in this format?
Oh, so many things. First of all, I just wouldn't underestimate the amount of work it takes to bring a new program to life. The time and effort is quite incredible when I look back on it. But really, so before you endeavor to bring a green bond or other ESG type program into being, I think you first want to consider the fit within your funding program and see if it makes sense for you. Do you need to broaden your investor base? Do you is this something that makes sense just brass tacks where you're starting from? And then consider whether you have buy-in from both the top and other levels of your organization, because there will be roadblocks. You will need a champion who can help knock those out of the way for you, but you'll also need people to do the work. There's a lot more work involved in these types of issues. And so you need both the top and the bottom working together to make it successful. Preparation is kind of key before you come to market. You have to have done all your homework, got all your ducks in a row. Dealer engagement is another key factor. Getting a framework together takes the input of so many people because you have your organizational view, but you also have external parties that can add a lot of value to putting a framework together that makes sense for you and makes sense for the market. And I'm just thinking, like, even things like the impact reporting, like you can't just issue the bond and then hope you'll figure out the impact reporting when the time comes a year later. So being prepared for that, putting processes in place that make a lot of sense because it's a program, not a one-off. You want to make sure you put in robust processes that when they are subject to audit, something like that, stand up well and really support your program and make your program shine in front of investors. So those are some ideas in that space of, what advice would you give? What kind of lessons have you learned? And then again, when we started with FIT, I would also just talk about projects. Do you have a pipeline of projects? If you have one project, there may be a different route to get that funded and get it recognized than a whole program being set up. That's my 2 cents worth on that.
Thank you. Jason, has that been your experience too? I mean, if a first-time issuer comes to you, do you generally steer them towards ESG, or is it really very selective?
You know what? We try to really take a customized approach, and in the past, I've been involved in discussions where we've strongly encouraged the issuer to delay to do some work at the corporate level, because you might hear this over and over, but the reputation in capital markets is something that's built over years, but that can be years built, seconds lost, and I think especially now, even though some people may feel like a transaction will go well because maybe the order book is very high and the funding benefits there, it doesn't mean there can't be any fallout afterwards from some of the press coverage and maybe some of the NGO articles. So we definitely really encourage to take your time and to make sure you dot dot the I's, cross the T's, and it's really branding, it's image, it's trust, and trust is very fragile. And I think we always encourage people to play the long game. And there's not only the green bond issuance side, but investors are also expressing opinions on the non-green side. And sometimes it could be a question of just fleshing out some of the ESG data and the carbon accounting that could yield just as much benefit before actually accessing the market. And I would say that oftentimes in the past, you can always have the minimum requirements, but you also have certain assurances that are out there that allow you to go above and beyond the minimum requirements that are prescribed by ICMA. So for some cases it makes sense, and others it may be less. So we really try to approach it on a case-by-case basis, and first and foremost, always make sure that we're preserving the integrity of the market, because there's still a substantial amount of capital that needs to move in order to green the infrastructure and meet the SDGs. So we don't want to compromise that reputation of what essentially is the second inning of a 9-inning baseball game.
So what is the best way to communicate with investors then? I mean, they're very confused by all the acronyms, by all the new structures, by many things, and they're also worried about greenwashing. So how do you kind of reach out to the buyers and keep them engaged? Maybe that's one for Elizabeth.
I guess the biggest piece of the communication puzzle with investors would be the annual impact report. At Ontario, we call it our Green Bond Newsletter, and we publish it in December of each year. And in that newsletter, you're updating, investors on what the selected projects are up to. You're talking about total funds allocated to projects. You're talking about whether or not you have an assurance audit that's been performed and what the outcome of that audit was. You're projecting the environmental benefits that are associated with your projects. You're talking about your overall processes in terms of how you identify, evaluate, and select projects. So all of those things are part of the communication package that investors should and do expect to be delivered to them on an annual basis. And then above and beyond that, there's things like this particular event and other events that are going on where you have the opportunity to reach out to investors because you're a panelist, because you're a speaker, or just because you're actually physically attending a conference. So you get the time to interact with investors in that format. And then also the one-on-ones. We do take one-on-one meetings and with investors, and we do make sure when we're having those that we have the right people in the room. So it wouldn't just be a funding person. If there's questions about the environmental aspects of a project, we'd make sure that our colleagues from the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks are in the room, in the same way that we would have an economist if people wanted to talk about the economy of Ontario. So we just make sure we have subject area experts available, and then investors feel they can reach out to us and ask the questions they need answers to, and we will take that very seriously and make sure that we provide the best level of communication we can, because it's really about transparency when you're talking about this market, sort of a cornerstone to the whole thing.
Anything else from the dealer side that you do, Jason, to keep the investors happy?
Yeah, and I think it's a dialogue of just saying, it's not just because you can, you should. I think most importantly, it's just been probably. We would encourage people to just be very transparent on what the bond is designed to achieve and what it's not designed to achieve. I think, but I think a lot of this is going to become quickly mathematical, as certainly as the IFRS Foundation sets up their headquarters and starts to set accounting standards. I think as well as just as the continuation of the ICMA Transition Finance Working Group, for example, that's looking at pathways, and even SBTI has been making some adaptation to some of their frameworks. So I think over time that there's an infrastructure that's building in place, but like all things, that takes time, and the market's improving incrementally on standards and guidelines. So I only see this becoming less and less of a challenge for people. And so I would just add that piece. The regulations coming down and the guidelines is really going to help as well going forward.
Right. Speaking of frameworks, Elizabeth, any evolution in the Ontario framework? Is there a need to update that potentially?
Oh, well, our framework dates to 2014. So this market was, for all intents and purposes, in its infancy, and in Canada was really not even perhaps on most people's radar. So we do have a framework. It does date back to 2014. It was put together in consultation with Cicero. It was I won't say updated, but there were adjustments made to it in 2019. We had a new government come into power in Ontario, and we took the opportunity to realign our green bond program to support the government's plan, which is preserving and protecting our environment for future generations, a Made in Ontario environment plan. But otherwise, it's substantially the document we originally drafted. And the green bond market has evolved. It's been more than 7 years now, and the expectations of investors and other market participants have changed. While our original framework has aged remarkably well, the province plans to update it in the near future, so I would expect that would be sometime in the next 6 to 8 months. Just guessing, but again, the workload's always much greater than I think it is, so perhaps it takes longer, but that's the idea. And we're going to look at the idea of even expanding the framework to be more of a sustainable framework so that we could issue off different platforms, not just green, if we had the need or if we wanted to. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And as an innovator in this market, are there any other currencies you consider issuing green bonds in, or any other structures that you haven't tried already that you'd like to maybe issue in?
Well, there's always lots of discussion around what we could possibly do with our green bond program, and that includes expanding it into other currencies. When we started, our commitment was to the Canadian market, to developing the Canadian green bond market. And in doing so, that sort of tethered us, if you will, to Canadian dollars for the foreseeable future. Having said that, international issuance is an important part of our overall borrowing program, and issuing green bonds in other currencies is an ongoing topic of internal discussion. So we recognize that international green bond markets could provide the opportunity to expand our investor base and also offer good price tension relative to non-green issues in those markets. So the discussion's ongoing. We do consider the possibility of issuing in US dollars, euros, or other currencies. Nothing along these lines has been decided at this time, and we'd have to take into account, obviously, things like market conditions, alternative funding opportunities, all of the things you normally would for issuing in any market. And really, the Canadian domestic market has been incredibly receptive to Ontario's green bond program, as evidenced by our most recent issue in July of this year, when we did our largest ever issue of $2.75 billion. So there's a little bit of push and a little bit of pull when you start to look at other markets. And I would say there's definitely pull from other markets. We think there's opportunity there, but we're not really getting pushed out of the Canadian market yet. So there's maybe two sides to that need to work together, and we're not quite there.
Okay, thank you. Question for both of you on greenwashing, which is a huge issue for a lot of people in this market because it's growing so quickly and it's quite confusing for a lot of investors. How do you mitigate that risk? I mean, and how big really is it, do you think, in the Canadian fixed income market?
Jason? Actually, I'll start. You have a much broader view, so you can overlay it. So the credibility of green bonds, it's an important issue for the market as a whole, because it doesn't do any of us any favors if that credibility is constantly being called into question. One of the ways we've tried to mitigate that idea is, having a third-party certifier to our framework, having the Auditor General come in and audit our use of proceeds annually. Those kinds of things hopefully help to indicate our honest effort to do the right thing the right way in this particular space. no one gets it exactly right all the time, but I think if you are having external parties come in and look at what you're doing and opine on that, that should help mitigate the greenwashing. I guess the idea that you might be greenwashing. And really, that's about all we can do at our level, is just always try and do our very best and try and reach the highest level we can with the program based, within the constraints and parameters we have. And I think if you're doing that, investors appreciate that kind of effort and sincerity in the effort. And with a few of those things like an audited use of proceeds and a third-party opinion go a long way to kind of, I think, giving credibility to what you're doing. But Jason, I defer to you on this. You have a much broader perspective.
No, I honestly couldn't have said it better myself. I would say that one thing that really helped was when the SPO providers started being more explicit about the issuer level alignment. There seemed to, at one point, to have been a disconnect between the use of proceeds and then there was an article in Bloomberg last August, was from the BIS, just talking about a sample of green bond issuers that hadn't achieved what they had set out from issuance in previous years. So now you have a much more formal link between the bond level and the company level. So I think that would made a big progress. And I agree, the assurances are important. And there's even the impact report in some cases. I know investors appreciate that. They appreciate the audited use of proceeds, as mentioned. And I think also just having high quality issuers such as the province of Ontario that could provide a blueprint and a template for others that are looking at the market for them to follow and try to always achieve that high standard. And I think also goes a long way to leading by example and having these issuers that demonstrate and not only that share their experience and their knowledge. Elizabeth, I know you've had an influence on me and helped me learn and grow in the space, and hopefully the others in the market, and hopefully we can bring that message to the other programs that are building. So I think it comes to a point as well as a show at some point and not tell, and having programs like this and other issuers that, without excluding any, I won't mention the others, but there are others as well that help us just to always try to keep the bar up there and keep the greenwashing at bay.